In 1933, a coal miner's wife in Harlan County, Kentucky, managed to feed her husband and 5 children on just 42 cents a week. She maintained a coffee can filled with bacon grease on the back of her stove that lasted for 9 months. Her situation was not unique. Across America, millions of grandmothers transformed a nickel into a full meal and stretched that meal into 3 days of sustenance. They possessed knowledge about food and frugality that has nearly disappeared from modern American households. One specific method saved more families from being evicted than any government initiative. Another was so commonplace in 1934 that no one even thought to write it down. And the most important one has been almost entirely forgotten, even though it could reduce a family's grocery expenses by nearly half. These 30 secrets were not merely poverty tactics, they were acts of genius. Let us examine the 30 Depression-era penny-stretching secrets our grandmothers relied upon that remain effective today. The bacon grease jar. Every kitchen during the Depression era had one. A tin can was kept on the back of the stove to collect every single drop. Nothing was ever poured down the drain. That grease served as the fat for frying eggs, seasoning cornbread, and maintaining cast-iron pans. A pound of bacon costing 22 cents generated enough grease to cook with for 2 weeks. The flavor of pork was infused into every dinner throughout the week. Even today, a tablespoon can turn a simple pot of green beans into a meal worth sitting down for, turning stale bread into 3 separate meals. In 1932, a loaf of bread cost 7 cents, and a grandmother could make that single loaf last until Friday. Stale bread was transformed into bread pudding using milk, sugar, and a cracked egg. It was turned into French toast fried in bacon grease. It became crumbs used to stretch a pound of ground beef into a meatloaf that could feed 6 people. Dry bread was never considered ruined. It was simply bread that had not yet discovered its second purpose. Saving the water from boiled vegetables. The cooking water from potatoes, beans, and cabbage was never poured down the drain. Instead, it was placed into a glass jar in the icebox to become the foundation for the next day's soup. Potato water helped bread rise higher. Bean water could turn a thin soup into something that tasted as though it had simmered all afternoon. If you had already paid for the flavor once, you did not let it run down the drain. The 4-Day Chicken Project. A whole chicken in 1933 cost 39 cents. For a family of 6, it was not just a single meal, it was a project. On Sunday, it was roasted whole and served with gravy. On Monday, the remaining meat was folded into a rice casserole. On Tuesday, the bones were simmered into a golden broth. On Wednesday, that broth was used to make chicken and dumplings. This provided 4 dinners from one bird at a cost of about 10 cents per meal. They were not being stingy, they were acting as engineers. The rent party casserole. When a family was only 1 week away from eviction, the neighbors would gather together. Everyone brought whatever they had available: a cup of rice, a handful of beans, half an onion, or a single egg. Everything was combined into a single dish and baked until it smelled like dinner. The family would then charge a nickel per plate. By the end of the evening, the rent was paid. Rent parties served as community insurance that cost nothing to maintain, using dried beans instead of canned ones. A pound of dried pinto beans cost 6 cents in 1934. A can of the same beans cost 11 cents and fed only half as many people. A grandmother looked at that math once and never purchased canned beans again. Dried beans were soaked overnight and then simmered for 4 hours with salt, pork, and an onion. A single pound produced 6 servings at a cost of just 1 penny per plate. The darning egg for socks. In 1933, socks cost 15 cents a pair. When the heel wore through, a grandmother would slip a wooden egg inside the sock and weave new thread across the hole. A pair mended twice a year could last for 3 winters instead of just 3 months. Over a lifetime, these savings amounted to nearly 2 days of wages. A pair of socks mended well still lasts longer than any pair bought new today. Flour sack dresses. By 1935, flour mills noticed that women were using cotton sacks to sew dresses, so they began printing the sacks with floral patterns in gingham. They knew every sack would have a second life as clothing. A 20-pound sack could become a girl's dress, while 4 sacks could be turned into a quilt top. A grandmother in Tennessee dressed her 3 daughters in flour sack cotton for 4 years. This remains one of the most beautiful examples of American frugality ever invented. Stretching coffee with chicory. A pound of coffee in 1933 cost 29 cents, while a pound of dried chicory cost only 9 cents. The mixture was typically 1 part chicory to 3 parts coffee, which added a dark, earthy note that many people eventually came to prefer. A pound that used to last a week could now last for 10 days. New Orleans still maintains the tradition of drinking coffee and chicory, though most of the rest of the country has forgotten it. Homemade cleaning products. Store-bought cleaning products in 1934 cost 19 cents a bottle. A grandmother mixed her own for less than a penny. She used a cup of vinegar, a quart of water, and a spoonful of baking soda. Vinegar was used to clean windows, countertops, and the inside of the icebox. Half a lemon could bring the shine back to a copper pot. Her kitchen smelled like nothing at all, which was exactly the point. Clean and perfumed were not considered the same thing. Saving the buttons. When a shirt wore out beyond the point of mending, the buttons were cut off first and dropped into a jar. A grandmother's button jar was one of the most precious items in the house. Some buttons had even been on her own grandmother's dress. Replacing a missing button cost nothing because the right one was already waiting in the jar. Over a decade, those savings added up to real money during a time when cash was incredibly scarce. The kitchen garden behind the house. A small 10 by 10 plot produced tomatoes, beans, cucumbers, and onions. Seed packets cost a nickel each, and the yield could feed a family for 4 months. A bushel of tomatoes harvested in August became 24-quart jars that lasted until April. A few nickels spent on seeds produced hundreds of meals. The mending basket. Every Depression-era home had one. It sat next to the reading chair, holding scissors, a pincushion, and spools of thread. If a hem came down during the day, it went into the basket that evening and was back on the hanger by morning. A loose button was sewn back on while the radio played. A small tear was prevented from becoming a large tear, and a loose button was prevented from becoming a lost button. The mending basket stopped waste at the source. The icebox inventory. An icebox in 1933 held perhaps 2 cubic feet of cold storage, and there was no back to it. A grandmother kept a mental inventory of everything inside, down to a half cup of gravy. The Tuesday roast would reappear in Wednesday's hash, Thursday's soup, and Friday's sandwich. Everything was used within 3 days. While the average American family now throws away 1/3 of the food they buy, a grandmother in 1934 threw away nothing. Backyard hens as currency. A hen laid roughly 200 eggs a year, and a grandmother kept track of every single one. Eggs were used as currency. A dozen eggs could be traded for a pound of sugar, and 2 dozen could pay for a can of coffee. A grandmother with 4 hens produced 800 eggs a year, allowing her to pay for items she could not afford with cash. She was essentially running a small, quiet business out of her backyard. The cornbread skillet that was never washed. A well-seasoned cast iron skillet was not just a pan, it was an inheritance. A grandmother would wipe it clean with a dry cloth and rub bacon grease across the surface. Water and soap never touched it. That skillet cost 39 cents new in 1930, and if used well, it would still be cooking cornbread in 1980. Modern nonstick pans often warp after only 2 years. The rule was to wipe, not wash. Rendering lard from butcher's fat scraps. A butcher in 1933 would often give away fat scraps for free. A grandmother would take a bag home, cut the scraps into cubes, and render them slowly on the stove. 3 hours later, the fat had melted into pure white lard, which was then strained into a clean jar. 1 pound of scraps produced enough to cook with for 2 weeks. This technique was so ordinary in 1934 that nobody bothered to write it down, and now it costs a fortune to relearn. The quilt top made from shirt scraps. When a shirt was too worn to be repaired, it was cut apart. The good pieces were placed into a box under the bed. When the box was full, a grandmother sewed the pieces into a quilt. A single quilt might take 2 years of shirt scraps to complete. A store-bought blanket cost nearly 2 days of wages, but a handmade scrap quilt cost nothing but time. These quilts now sell for hundreds of dollars at antique stores, a price those grandmothers would have laughed at. Stretching sugar with molasses. In 1934, a pound of white sugar cost 5 cents, while a pound of blackstrap molasses cost 3 cents and lasted twice as long. It was used to sweeten coffee, oatmeal, and cornbread, and it provided flavor for baked beans and gingerbread. A grandmother who replaced half her sugar with molasses could cut her sweetener bill nearly in half. Almost no one uses it for this purpose anymore. The single light bulb strategy. Depression-era grandmothers essentially invented zone lighting. They kept only one bulb on at a time, and the family would gather in whichever room had that bulb lit. When they moved to another room, the light moved with them. A family running one bulb instead of four could cut its electric bill by 75%. Modern homes often light every room regardless of whether anyone is in them or not. In 2019, researchers at Cornell University studied the household economics of families from the Depression era. What they discovered was not what anyone expected. The families that survived the best were not necessarily the ones with the highest income. Instead, they were the ones with the most skills. A grandmother who could mend a shirt, render fat, can tomatoes, and cook dried beans was wealthier in real terms than a factory worker who had a weekly paycheck but no skills. A 2021 survey found that 62% of Americans under the age of 40 cannot sew on a button. The skills that kept grandmothers afloat have been traded for convenience, and that convenience is expensive. They did not survive because they had more money. They survived because they knew how to turn what little they had into what they needed. The clothesline instead of the dryer. Grandmothers hung their wash on a line in the backyard. A full load could dry in 2 hours on a summer afternoon for no cost at all. The heat of a dryer wears out fabric faster than almost anything else in the house. A shirt dried on a line lasts twice as long as the same shirt dried in a machine. A clothesline costs about $15 and can last for 30 years. The sun is still free. The pressure cooker for cheap cuts. By the time of the Depression, pressure cookers were inexpensive enough that many families owned one. A tough, cheap cut of beef could become a tender stew in 35 minutes instead of 3 hours. The fuel savings alone could pay for the cooker within a year. It unlocked the potential of the cheapest cuts of meat, such as brisket, shank, and oxtail, making them tender in minutes. Only the memory of what it can do has faded. The soup pot that never stopped. On the back of every Depression-era stove, a soup pot simmered all week long. Monday's leftover vegetables went in, followed by Tuesday's chicken bones and Wednesday's onion ends. By Friday, the pot held a deep, rich broth that became Saturday's soup. The total cost was only about 3 cents, the price of salt and a bay leaf. A running soup pot is simply patience applied to the things other people throw away. Homemade laundry soap. Commercial soap in 1934 cost 19 cents a box. A grandmother made her own using a bar of grated lye soap, a cup of washing soda, and half a cup of borax. 1 tablespoon was enough to wash a full load. A batch lasted for 3 months and cost only 6 cents. It worked better than commercial soap on the types of dirt Depression-era families actually produced, such as coal dust, garden soil, and wood stove soot. The hand-me-down chain. Children almost never wore new clothes. A winter coat purchased for the oldest child in 1930 would make its way down through 3 more children, before finally being cut into strips for a rag rug in 1938. A single $4 coat worn by 4 children across 8 winters cost only 50 cents per child per winter. The grandmothers of 1934 would have considered skipping this chain to be nearly criminal. The home haircut. A barber charged 35 cents in 1933. For a family with 3 boys and 2 girls, that added up to nearly $3 a month. Instead, grandmothers cut the hair. A kitchen chair was pulled into the center of the room, a dish towel was placed over the shoulders, and the hair cutting began. Nobody left looking like they had been to a professional salon, but nobody needed to. The savings over a year were enough to buy a pair of winter boots. The newspaper that performed 3 jobs. A daily newspaper cost 2 cents. A grandmother bought it for the news, but the paper had 2 more jobs waiting. First, it was used to light the fire. Crumpled newspaper under kindling started a wood stove faster than anything else. Second, it was used to clean the windows. A damp wad of newspaper and vinegar worked better than any store-bought rag. A single newspaper earned its 2-cent cost 4 times over. The root cellar under the house. This was a small, dirt-floored room kept between 40 and 50 degrees year-round by the earth itself. It required no electricity and no maintenance. Inside, a grandmother stored the fall harvest, potatoes in wooden crates, onions hanging in mesh bags, and carrots buried in damp sand. Jars of canned tomatoes lined the walls. A well-stocked root cellar could feed a family from October through April. A good root cellar can work for 100 years. The community canning kitchen. In small towns across the South and Midwest, one house on each block often had the canning equipment. This included a large pressure canner, a set of jars, and a pot big enough to boil a dozen jars at once. Women brought their own produce. A grandmother with tomatoes would come on Tuesday, and a neighbor with green beans would come on Wednesday. Nobody paid money. One pressure canner, shared 10 ways, produced 10 times the food at 1/10 the cost. The community itself was the strategy. The Depression pantry rotation. This is the simplest secret on the list, the humblest, and the one most completely forgotten. A grandmother's pantry in 1934 was organized strictly by date. The newest cans and jars went to the back, while the oldest came to the front. Every item was used in the order it was purchased. Nothing languished and nothing expired. A modern American family throws away roughly 35% of the food it buys, mostly because items get pushed to the back of the shelf and forgotten. A Depression-era grandmother threw away essentially nothing. Oldest in front, newest in back. It required no equipment, no technology, and no special skill. It cost nothing, yet it saved nearly half of a family's grocery spending across a year. The coal miner's wife in Harlan County fed her husband and 5 children on 42 cents a week, partly because she never threw food away. The pantry rotation was the quiet engine behind every other trick on this list. It was not clever. It was just attention paid to what was already in the house. These 30 secrets were not poverty tricks. They were the distilled wisdom of a generation that had survived a collapse most Americans cannot imagine. A woman who could turn a Sunday chicken into 4 dinners and a flour sack into a daughter's dress was a woman who did not fear the end of the month. We traded all of that for convenience, and the trade has not been kind. The tools have not changed, and the math has not changed. Only the knowledge has faded. The grandmothers who lived through the Depression did not think they were being frugal. They thought they were just running a household. They were right, and we have almost forgotten what that looked like. If these stories of resilience and the wisdom of the past change how you look at the items in your own home, please subscribe and like the channel. We are uncovering the history and the skills that they tried to bury. Let us geotrong the future by remembering the past. The next treasury of forgotten secrets will be opened soon.